They said the war was over. They said the darkness had been defeated. But in 1945, as the ashes of Berlin cooled and Hitler's Reich lay in a ruin, a new kind of war began, one without front lines, uniforms, or declarations. It was a war fought in laboratories, in secret government offices, in the minds of men whose brilliance had been forged in the furnaces of destruction. And in that twilight between victory and vengeance, the United States made a decision that would change the course of modern civilization, to take the enemy's greatest minds and make them its own. The story begins in a world still trembling from the atomic bomb. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had just been obliterated. The world had glimpsed a power so vast that it could erase entire cities in seconds. America had emerged triumphant, but behind the celebration was fear. The Soviet Union, the new rival, was closing in on Europe, and intelligence reports whispered that Stalin scientists were hunting for the same German secrets that had given Hitler's regime its terrifying technological edge. In the ruins of Germany, Allied soldiers found blueprints for rockets that had flown higher and faster than any aircraft in existence. They found jet engines, nerve gas, experimental aircraft shaped like saucers, and mathematical formulas that could pierce the heavens. Most shocking of all, they found the men who had created them, scientists who had served the Third Reich, many of them high-ranking Nazis, responsible for weapons that had killed thousands. Among these men was Wernher von Braun, a name that would one day become synonymous with the U.S. space program. But in 1945, he was a man with blood on his hands. His V-2 rockets had rained death on London and Antwerp, killing civilians in silent bursts of fire. The missiles were built by slave laborers from concentration camps, men who starved, froze, and died under the brutal conditions of the Mittelwerk tunnels. Yet to American intelligence, von Braun was not a war criminal. He was an asset. The logic was simple, even if the morality was not. If the U.S. didn't take these men, the Soviets would. The race for the future had begun, and the spoils of war were no longer land or gold, they were knowledge. The operation had many names in its early days: Overcast, Safe Haven, Project 63. But the one that would stick, the one now etched into the darker corners of American history, was Operation Paperclip. The name came from a simple bureaucratic trick. When American officers reviewed the dossiers of captured German scientists, they would attach a paperclip to the files of those they wanted to secretly bring to the United States, even if the records listed them as ardent Nazis or security risks. With one simple gesture, a paperclip could erase a past soaked in blood. In secret briefings, President Harry Truman was told that these men were essential to national security. Officially, Truman signed an order forbidding the recruitment of active Nazis or anyone involved in atrocities. Unofficially, the American military and intelligence agencies ignored it. They sanitized the records, altered biographies, and produced clean versions of the scientists' histories. By the time their ships left Europe, their sins had been filed away in locked drawers, replaced with new identities and new destinies. It began quietly. In the summer of 1945, American teams moved through the ruins of Peenemünde, the once top-secret rocket base on the Baltic Sea. The Russians were only days away. Trucks loaded with blueprints, prototypes, and engineers rolled toward the American zones. In the dead of night, men who had sworn oaths to Adolf Hitler were escorted by U.S. soldiers through the shattered streets of Germany and flown to safety in the West. One of those men, von Braun, was nursing a broken arm from a car crash that had occurred while fleeing the Soviet advance. He carried with him a dream that had once been Hitler's, to reach the stars. To him, It didn't matter who paid for that dream as long as it came true. When the first group arrived in America, they were taken to Fort Bliss, Texas, under armed guard. Officially, they were special consultants working on ballistic research. In reality, they were the seeds of America's future space race. These scientists, who once built rockets to destroy cities, now built rockets to touch the heavens. The irony was almost poetic, but not everyone was fooled. In Washington, some congressmen demanded to know why war criminals were being brought to American soil instead of being tried at Nuremberg. The military brushed them off with talk of national security. The Cold War had already begun, and morality was a luxury the U.S. could no longer afford. As the years passed, Operation Paperclip expanded. Over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were eventually brought into the United States under the program. They came from every corner of Nazi research: rocketry, aerodynamics, chemical weapons, medicine, even psychological warfare. Some had direct ties to experiments conducted on human beings in concentration camps. Yet, one by one, they were given new homes, new paychecks, and in many cases, new names. In the laboratories of the American South and Midwest, the ghosts of the Third Reich quietly began building the technological backbone of the modern world. The same minds that had once dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich were now designing intercontinental missiles for the U.S. Army, developing experimental aircraft for the Air Force, and pioneering the very science that would one day carry men to the moon. And yet, beneath every rocket launch, beneath every patriotic speech about freedom and progress, there was a buried truth, one that haunted those who knew. The American dream of the space age had been built, in part, on the ruins of Nazi science. The public knew nothing, of course. To them, von Braun was a national hero. He appeared on television, smiling, charming, explaining space exploration to children. He worked with Walt Disney to create educational films about the future of humanity beyond Earth. Few knew that the same hands that gestured toward the stars had once signed orders for slave laborers to be executed if they slowed their work. By the 1950s, the United States had transformed from a victorious nation into a paranoid superpower, locked in an ideological deathmatch with the Soviet Union. Both sides raced to build bigger bombs, faster missiles, higher-reaching rockets. And behind both programs stood German scientists, the same men who had once saluted the Führer, now divided by ideology, but united by genius. In Moscow, Stalin's scientists worked from the same captured blueprints that American intelligence had smuggled out of Germany. The Soviet rocket program, led by Sergei Korolev, began testing long-range missiles just as von Braun's team in Alabama was doing the same. The space race was not a race between two nations. It was a race between two halves of the same stolen brain. The irony deepened when the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. America was humiliated. Politicians fumed. The media screamed that the U.S. had fallen behind. In response, the government poured billions into science and education, birthing NASA in 1958. And who became one of NASA's leading figures? Wernher von Braun, the former Nazi SS officer, now reborn as the father of American space exploration. As NASA rose, so did the myth. Von Braun became the face of optimism and innovation, a man who dreamed of colonies on Mars and reusable spacecraft. He adored him. Few remembered that the same hands that once worked directly under Heinrich Himmler's SS command, fewer still knew that the Army had whitewashed his record before bringing him to America. Even within the government, some began to question whether the cost had been too high. Investigative journalists uncovered fragments of the truth, files that had been misplaced, testimonies that didn't align,
whispers from within intelligence circles. In 1985, decades after the war, the U.S. Department of Justice quietly admitted that it had brought known Nazi collaborators into the country under Operation Paperclip. By then, most of them were either dead or revered as pioneers. What made Operation Paperclip so extraordinary and so disturbing was not just its secrecy, but its success. Without it, America might never have reached the moon. The Apollo program was built on the shoulders of German rocketry. The Saturn V, the mighty rocket that lifted Apollo 11 into space, bore the unmistakable fingerprints of Peenemünde. The technology that once terrorized Europe now symbolized human achievement. But there is a shadow under every triumph. The families of those who died in the Mittelwerk tunnels never saw justice. The prisoners who were tortured in Nazi laboratories were never acknowledged by the programs that used their data. Their suffering was erased, their names forgotten, replaced by the shining myth of progress. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all, that the line between good and evil, between patriotism and opportunism, can vanish when the stakes are high enough. Operation Paperclip was not just a story about science, it was a story about the human soul, about how far a nation will go in the name of security, and how easily history can be rewritten when genius serves power. In the end, the rockets reached the stars. America won the space race, and the men who once served a dictator helped carry the banner of democracy into the heavens. But somewhere, in the cold silence of space, the echoes of their past still linger, faint, distant, but never completely gone.
The war may have ended in 1945, but the ghosts of the Third Reich did not rest. They slipped quietly into laboratories and government offices across the Atlantic, reborn as engineers, physicists, chemists, and medical experts. As they unpacked their suitcases in the American desert or the quiet suburbs of the Midwest, the world entered a new age, one that would blur the line between progress and complicity. The American public, still recovering from the trauma of war, had no idea that men who once saluted Hitler were now drawing paychecks from the U.S. Army. Newspapers spoke of scientific collaboration and peaceful research. Behind closed doors, generals and intelligence officers knew the truth. This was not just research. It was a race to weaponize knowledge before the Soviets did. In Washington, a secretive network of military and intelligence agencies expanded rapidly. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, America's wartime intelligence service, had evolved into something larger, darker, and far more permanent: the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. And the CIA's hunger for information was insatiable. It wasn't enough to have the German rocket engineers. They wanted everything the Nazis had learned. Every experiment, every chemical formula, every medical result, no matter how it had been obtained. In the ruins of Dachau and Auschwitz, American officers found entire archives of Nazi medical research. Data collected from human experimentation so horrific that even hardened soldiers could barely read the reports. The victims had been frozen alive, injected with diseases, exposed to poison gas, and dissected without anesthesia, all in the name of science. Instead of destroying those records, U.S. intelligence classified them. Certain files were quietly shared with military doctors and pharmaceutical companies. The justification was always the same: we can't let this information fall into Soviet hands. That rationale became the moral shield for everything that followed. By the late 1940s, Operation Paperclip had expanded far beyond rocketry. It became a system, a machine designed to absorb the enemy's intellect while erasing their crimes. The American Army Air Forces, which would soon become the U.S. Air Force, brought over aerodynamicists and jet engineers who had tested experimental planes at high altitudes, sometimes on unwilling human subjects. Chemical warfare experts who had designed deadly nerve agents like sarin were given new laboratories in Maryland and Utah. Even the Biological Warfare Division at Fort Detrick quietly recruited former Nazi researchers. The same men who had studied typhus and plague in concentration camps were now working under the American flag to develop defenses and possibly offenses against biological weapons. Meanwhile, the rocket team led by Wernher von Braun continued to thrive. In White Sands, New Mexico, they launched their first American V-2s into the desert sky. It was the same rocket that had once killed thousands in Europe, now adorned with U.S. Army markings. Von Braun and his team were treated like prized stallions, guarded, funded, and admired. But beneath the excitement, there was unease. Some officers could not ignore who these men really were. Colonel Holger Toftoy, who oversaw the Paperclip program, admitted privately that many of them should probably be tried for war crimes, yet insisted, "We need their brains." It was the cold arithmetic of the Cold War. Ethics weighed against utility. When President Truman was asked about it, he denied knowing the extent of the operation. He said, "We're not employing Nazis." But the documents, hidden under layers of secrecy, told a different story. Files were rewritten, membership in the Nazi Party erased, SS ranks deleted. Men who once wore the Death's Head insignia now had crisp American uniforms and new security clearances. The American press, busy celebrating the booming post-war economy, rarely asked questions. The nation wanted heroes, not reminders of horror. By 1950, Operation Paperclip's influence had spread into the newly emerging military-industrial complex. Aerospace companies like Boeing, North American Aviation, and Bell Aircraft began hiring former German scientists through military contracts. In laboratories funded by the Pentagon, they experimented with supersonic flight, missile guidance, and jet propulsion. Some of these experiments would lead directly to breakthroughs that defined the 20th century. Others would cross ethical lines so disturbing that their files would remain classified for decades.
One of the darkest offshoots of Paperclip was the birth of psychological warfare research, a field that blended psychiatry, pharmacology, and covert control. In the 1950s, as the U.S. learned that Soviet scientists were experimenting with mind-altering drugs, the CIA launched its own secret projects to explore the limits of human consciousness. It was the beginning of Project MK Ultra. Many of the scientists involved in MK Ultra were either directly connected to or inspired by the German doctors brought over after the war. They studied techniques of interrogation, hypnosis, and chemical manipulation, often on unwitting subjects. LSD, electric shocks, sleep deprivation, all were tested in the name of national security. The logic echoed that of Operation Paperclip. If the enemy is willing to do it, we must do it too. Von Braun, meanwhile, was becoming a national celebrity. His rockets were reaching higher altitudes. He published papers predicting space stations, lunar landings, even manned missions to Mars. Walt Disney invited him to appear in a television series called Man in Space, where von Braun spoke directly to American families, smiling as he sketched futuristic spacecraft on a chalkboard. Children across the country sent him fan mail. Few viewers knew that just 10 years earlier, prisoners had died screaming beneath his rockets. Inside NASA, there were scientists who knew the truth. Some spoke in whispers. Most stayed silent. The Cold War had no patience for moral debates. The Russians had launched Sputnik in 1957, and America needed results. Von Braun delivered. His designs evolved into the Redstone and Jupiter missiles, then into the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built. When Apollo 11 carried Neil Armstrong to the moon in 1969, von Braun was at the center of it all, applauded by presidents, honored by universities, hailed as the man who had fulfilled humanity's oldest dream. The newspapers wrote about courage, ingenuity, and the triumph of American science. None mentioned the paperclips. But in the shadows, a few investigators had not forgotten. In the 1970s, a group of journalists and historians began uncovering declassified files from the U.S. Army and the State Department. Among them was Linda Hunt, whose research would later expose the extent of the paperclip network. Her discoveries were staggering. Many of the scientists recruited had been deeply involved in atrocities. Some had experimented on prisoners. Others had produced weapons of mass destruction for the Reich. Yet they had lived comfortable lives in America, protected by the government that had once sworn to fight tyranny. The files also revealed how the CIA and the military had repeatedly lied to Congress, erasing evidence and rewriting history. One memo described how Nazi affiliations were removed from personal dossiers to make the scientists more acceptable to the American public. By then, it was too late for justice. Von Braun died in 1977, buried with full honors. His tombstone bore a Bible verse from Psalm 19, "The heavens declare the glory of God." Few knew that beneath those words lay the contradictions of a man who had served both God and the Reich, both science and power. The paperclip legacy lived on, hidden in plain sight. The U.S. missile defense systems, the early satellites, the moon missions, the stealth aircraft, all carried traces of the knowledge harvested in 1945. Even the modern tech industry, decades later, would evolve from military research funded by those early programs. Operation Paperclip had not just imported scientists, it had imported an ideology that the pursuit of knowledge justifies almost anything. It taught the world that morality could be rewritten if the prize was great enough. As the 20th century closed, new wars arose, wars of data, of surveillance, of invisible machines in the sky. The same reasoning that justified bringing Nazi scientists to America now justified collecting the private information of millions, building weapons that could kill without pilots, creating technologies that could listen, watch, and predict. The new descendants of Operation Paperclip's laboratories no longer needed paperclips to hide the truth. The new science of secrecy had evolved beyond files. It was embedded in the very systems people used every day. In a way, the story of Operation Paperclip never ended. It simply changed form. Every rocket launch, every satellite orbiting Earth, every missile silo buried in the desert, each carried within it a fragment of that moment in 1945 when the victors of war decided that genius was worth any price. And somewhere, deep in the archives of the Pentagon, the original paperclip files still exist, yellowed pages held together by rusting metal clips, the ghosts of history silently whispering the cost of progress. Because in the end, the most astonishing truth about Operation Paperclip is not that America made a deal with the devil, it's that it worked.